for too long and how we tend to stray away from God as we wait. And so one of the many things that we share in common with the disciples in this passage of Scripture is that we sometimes have the inability to wait patiently for a very long time. If this period of social distancing has taught us anything about ourselves, it is we do not like to have a time of waiting for a long period. We don't like to be idle for too long. We have to stay busy. We have to do something. We can't just sit around and do nothing. Even my 4-year-old daughter understands this. She's always getting, when we're telling her to be patient and to wait, she is always saying it is hard to wait. It is hard to be patient because she wants to do something now. It becomes especially harder to wait when you are wanting to move forward, when you are wanting to take action, when you are wanting to do something. For the disciples, they have been stuck for a long time on the shores of Galilee, waiting for Christ to appear as he said he was going to come to them. And yet, as they sit on the shore, Peter is watching the boats go in and out from shore. And finally, Peter has had enough. And he has to do something. So he turns to his fellow disciples and he says, I am going to fishing. For he needs to do something. He needs to do anything. He needs to take action. And so Peter, in his desperation to do something, anything, he decides to go fishing. He is returning to the way of life he used to know before Jesus called him. He thought he could go back to the way of things were before. So Peter was tired of waiting and he was tired of being idle for too long, and he was going to do something. When I read this passage of Scripture, I kind of think that Peter is kind of more of an action hero, because he is always a man of action. He is always wanting to do something. He is not waiting. He just jumps right in. When we look, after all, we see Peter throughout Scripture kind of being a man who acts first, takes questions later. We see him jumping out of the boat to walk on water. Or when Jesus is arrested, we see him coming to the defense of Christ when he is betrayed in the garden. You see, Peter is a man of action, and waiting is not in his fiber of being. So while waiting for Christ on the sea in Galilee, this waiting is eating at Peter. Being idle was not part of him. He had to do something. For we all have heard some adaptation of Henry David Thoreau saying, the devil finds work for idle hands. And this is what happens when idle people get nervous about waiting. We have to do something, and Peter had been idle for too long, so he had to do something. Peter cannot just stand being on the shores waiting. And so he does just like the writers of the Proverbs do when somebody has nothing to do. Idle hands make one poor, but diligent hands bring wealth, says Proverbs 10:4. Or in Proverbs 12:27, the idle do not roast any game, but they diligent feed on the riches of the hunt. You see, when we are idle, we get ourselves into trouble. When we have to wait too long for us to do something. This happens quite often to my 4-year-old daughter. When we tell her to wait, she is not patient enough. She just wants to do it immediately. And so she goes and does it before we are ready. And this causes her to get in a little trouble because we have to pull her aside and say, did we not tell you to wait? And then she gives us her standard reply, but waiting is hard. I just wanted to do it. So I went and did it. You see, at some point, idleness eats at us to where we feel the urgent need to do something, anything. And as this social distancing shows us, that this urgent need to do something can lead us into trouble, can lead us to do things which are not what we normally like to do. I mean, a great example of this is look at what happens when Moses goes up to the mountain to receive instructions from God and brings back the Ten Commandments. And when he was gone too long, in Exodus 32:1, when the people saw that Moses was long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us a gods who go before us, as this fellow Moses who brought us out of Egypt. We don't know what has happened to him." The people grew tired of waiting. They grew tired of being idle at the base of the mountain while Moses was up on the mountain communing with God. And they were anxious. They wanted to do something. And so they did something that will end up getting them in trouble. They go to Aaron and say, "Come, make us gods who will go before us, just as this fellow Moses brought us out of Egypt," because he was too long gone up the mountain. Much in the same way, Peter was getting tired of waiting and sitting on his hands. Peter wanted to take action, so he was going to do something. And he finally says, "I cannot take it anymore. I'm going fishing." Sounds like a great thing many of us would like to do. But yet he was going to do. He was heading off to do what he had been raised to do since he was a boy. He was raised on this very sea. Before him, he was growing tired of watching the boats go in and out with their catch of fish, and was being taunted by them. And so he decided that he was tired of waiting for Christ to appear. So he went out to fish, and 6 other disciples went with him. We see here that waiting is hard. Being patient as you wait takes a toll on you. And you want to do something. And being idle is not good for us. Sometimes we force things or do things which keep us from seeing what God has in store for us. Keeps us from seeing how he's going to appear in our lives and reveal himself to us. We want to do things, so we rush them. We desire for action. And so we no longer are waiting or willing to wait. And when we are stuck waiting, our desired actions tend to make us fall back on the old way of doing things. On the falling back to old habits. You see, the problem is when we have idle hands, just as Henry David Thoreau points out, if we are stuck waiting for long enough, we tend to get into trouble. And when we get into trouble, this usually means we revert back to the old ways of life. And this causes us to go into our bad habits. For before Peter was called by Christ, Peter was a fisherman. So when he was waiting on the sea, on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, the waiting became unbearable. Seeing all the fish, the boats going in and out, his hands had been idle for too long, so he falls back into the old ways of doing. He exclaims, "I am going fishing." Just as Peter says when we get tired of waiting that I am going fishing, we too tend to fall back on our old ways of doing things if we are caught waiting for too long. And this period of social distancing has created a period of time where waiting has become longer than we really want. And we have started to fall back to our old ways of living our lives. We are starting to see abuse on the rise, physical